First thoughts with Michael Wardlow.
Good morning. I'm delighted that Father Martin asked me to take part in this series of first thoughts. And I thought today I want to give you my first thoughts on a very familiar passage. So rather than read it in a familiar version, I thought I would read it in Eugene Peterson's The Message. I'm suggesting that with me you listen and try to say, what are the first thoughts when I hear these very familiar words being read out to me? So read with me Matthew chapter 12 and the first 8 verses. One Sabbath, Jesus was strolling with his disciples through a field of ripe grain. Hungry, the disciples were pulling off the heads of grain and munching on them. Some Pharisees reported them to Jesus. Your disciples are breaking the Sabbath rules. Jesus said, really? Didn't you ever read what David and his companions did when they were hungry? How they entered the sanctuary, they ate bread off the altar, bread that no one but priests were allowed to eat. And didn't you ever read in God's law that priests carrying out the temple duties break Sabbath rules all the time? And that's not held against them. There is far more at stake here than religion. For if you had any idea what Scripture means, I prefer a flexible heart to an inflexible ritual, you wouldn't be nitpicking like this. For the Son of Man is no lackey to the Sabbath. He's in charge. Now, I don't know about you, but those are powerful words in 8 short verses. So my first thoughts were when I started reading that the chapter actually opens with a Greek word, time. At this time. Now, the Greek language has 2 words for time. One is chronos, and that's the one that thinks of time as a ticking clock. We have a chronological sequence of something. And the other one is kairos, which really means opportunity. And that's the word that's used here. So my first thoughts were, what was this all about? Why was this specific time important to Jesus? Well, if we think of the chronos time, the ticking clock time, what had happened to the state? Well, Jesus had been in his first year of ministry. It was a year of obscurity. At this stage, he'd healed lots of people. He'd thrown out demons. He'd called the 12 disciples to follow him, and they'd seen strange things, including the healing of Peter's mom-in-law and also the calming of a storm. He had been confronted with legalism, realizing that religion had grown up to be this edifice. Rather than something of the heart, it became something of the head. And he found that, and so his disciples, that they were being challenged on it. So now enters the question of, well, why this moment? Well, Jesus actually chose a Sabbath to do this encounter. He chose his moment. It could have been any other day in the week. So in that sense, Jesus knew this was the time, the God time, the opportunity time, the kairos time to do something about legalism. It was a very simple, straightforward act. The disciples and he were walking through a field. They had plucked some corn, they rubbed it between their fingers, and one of the 613 precepts of the law that the Pharisees had built up, that things you couldn't do on a Sabbath, one of them was that you couldn't actually use your fingers to tie knots, although a woman could tie up her girdle, but you couldn't glean. In other words, you couldn't actually grind corn. So this was nitpicking. And they said, listen, you're meant to be someone of importance, you're meant to be a rabbi, and yet you're allowing your disciples to do this. They were picking on legalism. And I can imagine Jesus saying, this is my kairos, this is the opportunity for me to say something. And in verse 7 and verse 6, he says, there is more at stake here than just religion. Because what the Pharisees were so fixated on, it seems to me, was religion, was religiosity. It was the structure, it was the housing, but it actually had no animation, it had no soul, it had no heart, it had no passion. And Jesus reminded them of Hosea. Lovely translation in Peterson. I prefer a flexible heart to inflexible ritual. So that was my first thoughts. How often do I get caught up in inflexible religion? How often do I lead with the rules and the rhetoric and the rubric and set aside the passion and the compassion and the mercy? Thomas Merton has a lovely saying, if you love peace, then hate injustice, hate tyranny, and hate greed. And I can just imagine us all getting superior. Yeah, that's me. But in case we did, he pulls us back to earth. And the finish of that quote is, but hate these things in yourself, not in the other. And it struck me in all of this that Jesus didn't condemn the Pharisees. he showed love, he showed compassion, he showed the opportunity for them to get back again, that they could say that they had been actually focusing on the inflexibility of religion rather than the flexibility of the human heart. And so let me just end with a quote from John O'Donoghue, one of my favorite Celtic poets and writers. And he says this: remember that love is the deepest power of prayer. So my first thoughts, indeed my last thoughts this morning, are love people, go for the flexibility of the human heart, and leave aside the inflexibility of religiosity. It will liberate you and it will liberate the other. Thanks for listening and have a good day.